Now, if you were to take a bunch of early Americans and cut them open, you'd find that westward expansion was coded all the way down to their dang DNA. And after they got metric buttloads of land in the Treaty of Paris, they thought that all their westward migration dreams were coming true. But here's where I tell you that it wasn't all puppies and rainbows, and I reckon we ought to talk about it. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, now remember that Big Mama Britain had prohibited westward migration after the French and Indian War, even though that victory gave them access to the oh-so-tasty lands in the Ohio River Valley. But after the American Revolution, all those lands belonged squarely to the US government, and that meant that Americans got their migration on quick, fast, and in a hurry. But wait a minute, why did Big Mama Britain prevent such migration in the first place? Well, one of the main reasons was that the westward movement of the colonists would for sure lead to conflicts with the American Indian groups who already lived there. And guess what? That reality in no way changed now that the territory belonged to the US. So that means it's time to talk about how migrating Americans caused conflict with American Indian groups. So not only did Americans want to migrate west in order to establish homesteads and get their agriculture on, they also wanted to prove a point to the American Indians who lived there. And that point, my dear pupil, was this. You see, even though the British and the Spanish maintained a presence in the Western Territory, Americans were keen to migrate and settle there in order to convince the American Indians that the land belonged to them and not to the European power. And so, as Americans migrated and settled, often without legal ownership of the land, American Indians were displaced and were forced onto smaller and smaller tracts of land. But the American Indians didn't just roll over and accept this intrusion. No, the massive wave of migrants resulted in new American Indian alliances coordinated to resist the migration of white settlers. And to put it mildly, clashes occurred to the great vexation of American settlers. At which point, Big Mama Britain, scorned but by no means less sassy, was like, huh, how y'all like me now? Anyway, all of this was going on during the era of the Articles of Confederation, and because the federal government was about as weak as the fruit flavor in a can of LaCroix, there was almost nothing they could do to effectively address the growing tensions. However, once the Articles were tossed and the Constitution was ratified, the federal government flexed its new muscles and attempted to solve the problems which migration had caused with American Indians. Now, one of the first laws passed was the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act of 1790. Essentially, the law made it the prerogative of the federal government to regulate settlement of the Western Territory of the United States and to make sure that American Indians were treated fairly in the process. Oh wow, that feels really good. Like, I'm so glad that American Indians, after having been so long treated poorly by the Americans and their government, are going to receive some equitable dealings. Okay, I'm getting word that American settlers basically just ignored that law and continued to push westward, which intensified the conflict with American Indian groups all the more. So, on brand. Anyway, adding to the conflict was Great Britain's meddling in the whole mess. It turns out that they had not honored the agreement in the Treaty of Paris to evacuate their posts on the western border. But don't worry, what they did instead was to arm American Indians and encourage them to attack American settlements in the Ohio River Valley. And Spain pulled the same dirty trick further south by arming Creeks and Cherokees who used those weapons to resist American westward expansion. But hey, if there's one thing you do not do to big baby America is to make it harder to migrate west. And so in order to address these increasing conflicts, George Washington dispatched about 2,000 American soldiers into the Ohio country to subdue the American Indians who were harassing the U.S. settlers. And there the troops met an alliance of American Indians in the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. And in the end, the U.S. secured a decisive victory, and that led to the signing of the Treaty of Greenville. And in this treaty, the defeated indigenous alliance surrendered their claim to vast tracts of land in the Ohio Territory and effectively opened it for American settlement without resistance. The treaty also made provision for the defeated tribes to receive annual payments from the federal government, which effectively made them dependent on such payments and thus more vulnerable to further removal from their land in later periods. And then after that, two other developments occurred which got the migration-stoked Americans so excited that they peed in their pants a little. But, just a little. The first was the signing of Jay's Treaty in 1794. Now, to be fair, a lot of Americans thought this treaty was kind of a turd sandwich, but it did do one thing that cleared the way for more migration. Basically, Great Britain agreed to withdraw its forces from the western borderlands. And as a result, American Indians saw little hope for resisting American encroachment on their ancestral lands, and that may have contributed to their concessions in the Treaty of Greenville. And then the second development occurred 2 years later when the United States ratified the Pinckney Treaty with Spain. Now, this agreement formally recognized the borders between the U.S. and Spanish territory while also opening the port of New Orleans and the Mississippi River to U.S. merchants. And that was just fine to the Americans because this treaty effectively ended Spanish opposition to U.S. westward expansion in the South while also making it easier for Americans to transport goods along the Mississippi River. Okay, now the other big part of this topic has to do with the expansion of slavery during this period. You see, Southern planters were eager to migrate west in search of new land to plant. And that's because high-demand crops like tobacco and cotton sucked the nutrients right out of the soil. Therefore, in order to keep pace, especially with increasing European demands for those goods, planters began to migrate westward in large numbers. And as you might have guessed, as they migrated, they went ahead and brought slavery with them, and that started brewing a different conflict in the new nation. You see, in the northern states, a growing movement for the abolition of slavery began to take shape. Some argued for abolition on account of their religious convictions against the brutality of slavery, folks like the Quakers and the Mennonites. And then others were motivated by Enlightenment ideas about the equality of all people. But to be absolutely clear, it wasn't just the northerners who were getting a little squeamish about slavery. No, even some prominent southerners were getting some rumblies in their tumblies about this inhumane institution. For example, folks like James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, both of whom relied on enslaved blacks for their wealth, were uneasy about the institution and hoped that it would gradually pass away as more and more immigrants arrived who could work for low wages. But I'm sad to tell you that did not in fact occur. You see, in 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which greatly increased the efficiency with which cotton could be processed. And in doing so, cotton productivity rapidly increased, and so did the demand for the raw material. And so that development led to a sharp increase in the demand for enslaved blacks to work the cotton fields, and that meant slavery became even more entrenched in the South. And because their economy depended so heavily on the growth and export of cotton, many Southern planters refused to consider any notion of abolition. And that commitment, therefore, began to reveal intense regional disagreement over the presence of slavery in the United States. But I should mention that at this point, the general opinion about slavery in the South was that it was a necessary evil. And that's important because in the next period, we're going to see that opinion shift dramatically so that slavery in the South was considered a positive good. And that makes me wonder if we're going to see any further conflict over this issue later in the course. So, who knows? Okay, you can click here to keep watching my other Unit 3 videos, or you can click here to grab my APUSH Heimler review guide, which has everything you need to study as fast as possible. I appreciate you stopping by, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.